What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 4.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and give you my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL this week. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, NFL Week 4. I have an extra long starts and sits video for you here this week, so let's get into it. At the quarterback position, I'm going to start Ben Roethlisberger from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 8th worst defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Ben Roethlisberger has averaged 20.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.7 rush attempts per game. He's projected at 18.8 fantasy points here in Week 4, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with Pittsburgh only favored by 1.5. So it's a pretty high scoring game and a competitive game. So I'm going to start Ben Roethlisberger here versus the Tennessee Titans. Now I'm also going to start Matthew Stafford from the Detroit Lions playing the New Orleans Saints, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Matthew Stafford has averaged 17.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting 2.3 rush attempts per game, and he's projected at 18.3 fantasy points here in Week 4. Now remember, he's got his number 1 receiver, Kenny Golladay, back, so that's going to be a big help. He's got a nice matchup this week. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45 points scored in this game, and they have this game pretty close, within a touchdown, but the Detroit Lions should fall behind the New Orleans Saints. Should be a passing game script, so I like Matthew Stafford here versus the New Orleans Saints. Okay, now I'm going to sit Mitchell Trubisky here from the Chicago Bears playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have the absolute best defense overall, and they've given up the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Mitchell Trubisky, he's averaged 17.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He's only getting 2.7 rush attempts per game, only had 1 rush attempt last game, and he really hasn't had a good performance since his Week 1 performance. He put up 24 fantasy points, but then it was 15 and only 13 fantasy points last week. Now he's got a terrible matchup here versus the Colts. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Chicago Bears trailing by 2.5. So I'm going to sit Mitchell Trubisky here versus the Indianapolis Colts. And another quarterback that I'm going to sit here in Week 4 is Philip Rivers from the Indianapolis Colts playing the Chicago Bears, who have a good defense overall, and they give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Philip Rivers has only averaged 13.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 1.7 rush attempts per game. He hasn't been very good this year. Think it's time to put him on the bench if you haven't already. Projected at 17.6 fantasy points here in Week 4, but he's got a low floor, only scoring 12 fantasy points in Week 2, 13 fantasy points in Week 3. And we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Colts favored by 2.5. So I'm going to sit Philip Rivers here versus the Chicago Bears. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. I'm going to start James Robinson from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the fourth most fantasy points to opposing running backs. James Robinson has averaged 19 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.3 rush attempts per game and 3.7 pass targets per game. He got 11 rush attempts and 6 pass targets last week, scoring 28 fantasy points. He's projected at 13.6 fantasy points here in week 4. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Jacksonville Jaguars trailing by 3. So this is a nice running back matchup. His volume, when you include the pass targets, looks to be pretty good, almost 20 touches a week. So I like James Robinson, or I'm going to start James Robinson here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Another running back I'm going to start is Mike Davis from the Carolina Panthers, playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have a good defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Mike Davis has averaged 10.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.7 rush attempts per game. But remember, the first week that he came in, it was week 2, and it was for an injured Christian McCaffrey. Last week, as the starter, he got 13 rush attempts and 9 pass targets. So I love that passing volume, really gives this player a boost, and he scored 19 fantasy points last week. He's projected at 11.4 fantasy points here in week 4. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, with the Carolina Panthers trailing by 4. So it's a closer game than people might think. That 4-point spread is not too much, so even if they do fall behind, Mike Davis is involved in the passing game, and that's what makes him a valuable fantasy player with Christian McCaffrey out. So I'm going to start Mike Davis here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Another running back I'm going to start is Myles Gaskin from the Miami Dolphins, playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the second worst defense overall. And although they've been pretty good versus opposing running backs, Myles Gaskin, he's averaging 12.7 fantasy points. He's averaging 12.7 rush attempts per game on the season and 5.3 pass targets per game. Last week, he got 22 rush attempts and 5 pass targets, so that's a ton of volume. He only scored 12 fantasy points, but with that kind of volume, it's just a matter of time before he puts up a big fantasy day. Now, he's only projected at 9.5 fantasy points here in week 4, but he's on the field for 68% of the snaps, and he touches the ball 40% of that time. Vegas thinks there's going to be 54.5 points scored in this game, with the Miami Dolphins trailing by 7. We saw last week that the Miami Dolphins can put points on the board. This is projected to be a high-scoring game, pretty close game within a touchdown here, considering they're playing the Seattle Seahawks. But Myles Gaskin does get involved in the passing game, so even if they fall behind, he should still be out there catching passes. Now, I would only start Myles Gaskin if you're struggling at the running back position and looking for one of those lower-end players to get the start. But if you are, I'm going to start Myles Gaskin here versus the Seattle Seahawks. And another running back I'm going to start, this is the same scenario as Myles Gaskin here. If you're struggling at the running back position, you need to pick up another player or you have him on your bench, I'm going to start Kareem Hunt from the Cleveland Browns, playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the second worst defense overall. And although they've been pretty good versus opposing running backs, Kareem Hunt has averaged 15.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 13 rush attempts per game and 3.7 pass targets per game. He got 16 rush attempts last week and 3 pass targets, put up 13 fantasy points. He's been consistently scoring fantasy points throughout the season. He's projected at 12 fantasy points here in week 4. Vegas thinks there's going to be 55.5 points scored in this game. They have the Cleveland Browns trailing by 5, but again, with Kareem Hunt, He's involved in the passing game, so even if they fall behind, he'll be out there catching passes. It's a high-scoring game, so I like I'm going to start Kareem Hunt here versus the Dallas Cowboys.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks.
Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups. Okay, now looking at a running back that I'm going to sit here in week 4, I'm going to sit David Montgomery from the Chicago Bears playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have the best defense overall, and they only give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. David Montgomery, he's averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game on the season off of 14.3 rush attempts per game and 3 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 52% of the snaps, touching the ball 47% of that time. He's projected at 11 fantasy points here in week 4. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Bears trailing by 2.5. I just don't like this matchup for David Montgomery. I think there's better options to start at the running back position if you have them. If you're struggling at the running back position, you don't have anyone else, of course you're going to start David Montgomery. But if you can go with another running back here in week 4, I would sit David Montgomery here versus the Indianapolis Colts. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. I'm going to start Kenny Golladay from the Detroit Lions playing the New Orleans Saints, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Remember, Kenny Golladay just came back last week. He was injured, but he made his season debut last week. So he scored 14.7 fantasy points last week off of 7 pass targets. So there's no concern with that injury. He's good to go. He's on the field for 72% of the snaps. He touched the ball 14% of that time. He's projected at 11.6 fantasy points here in week 4. And Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 54.5 points scored in this game. They have this game within a touchdown, so relatively close, competitive game here. So I'm going to start Kenny Golladay here versus the New Orleans Saints. Another wide receiver that I'm going to start here, I'm going to give you 2 wide receivers that I'm going to start, both on the same team here. They might be flying under your radar, but I'm going to start Michael Gallup from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Cleveland Cavaliers, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Michael Gallup has averaged 12 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.3 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 91% of the snaps. He touches the ball 9% of that time. He scored 23 fantasy points last week off of 9 pass targets. He's projected at 11.2 fantasy points here in week 4. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 55.5 points scored in this game, with the Dallas Cowboys favored by 5. It's a nice matchup here. So I'm going to start Michael Gallup here versus the Cleveland Browns. Now, if you don't have Michael Gallup, you may be able to get, or maybe you've already picked up from the waiver wire, CeeDee Lamb from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 10th worst defense overall. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. CeeDee Lamb has averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7 pass targets per game, and he's on the field for 75% of the snaps, touches the ball 13% of the time. He's projected at 11.1 fantasy points here in week 4. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 55.5 points scored in this game, so a high-scoring game. Cowboys favored by 5, a great matchup. So I'm going to start CeeDee Lamb or Michael Gallup. Don't start them both on the same team, but if you have one of them, or if you're able to pick one of those guys up, they're in a great spot here in week 4. So I'm going to start Michael Gallup or CeeDee Lamb here versus the Cleveland Browns. Okay, now looking for a wide receiver that I'm going to sit here in week 4. I'm going to sit DJ Moore from the Carolina Panthers playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have a good defense overall, and they give up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DJ Moore has averaged 10.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.7 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 88% of the snaps, touches the ball 15% of that time. Now, he doesn't have a bad stat line here. He did only score 8 fantasy points last week off of 4 pass targets. I just don't like this matchup versus the Cardinals. I think there's better options at the wide receiver position, like I would start Michael Gallup or CeeDee Lamb over DJ Moore. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Panthers trailing by 4. So I'm going to sit DJ Moore here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Okay, another wide receiver I'm going to sit. Maybe you've been waiting for this guy to break out, or you know his name and he's done well in the previous years. But just in case you haven't got the notice yet, I'm going to sit Larry Fitzgerald here versus, from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Larry Fitzgerald has only averaged 4.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5 pass targets per game. Now, although he's on the field for 81% of the snaps, he's just not getting a ton of volume, and he only put up 1 fantasy point last week off of 3 pass targets. He is projected at 9 fantasy points here in week 4, but I'm not going to risk starting Larry Fitzgerald. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Cardinals favored by 4. So it's a middle-of-the-pack matchup here, but just not enough volume for me to give this guy the start. So I'm going to sit Larry Fitzgerald here versus the Carolina Panthers. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I'm going to start TJ Hawkinson from the Detroit Lions playing the New Orleans Saints, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. TJ Hawkinson, he's averaged 9.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.3 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 72% of the snaps. He touches the ball 11% of that time, projected at 9.4 fantasy points here in week 4. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game. Okay, and it looks like the line has updated here. Looks like they have this game within 1.5 points. So that's a close, competitive game. It's a great matchup. So I'm going to start TJ Hawkinson here versus the New Orleans Saints. Now, tight ends always seem like they're that elusive fantasy football position. If you don't have a great tight end on your roster, sometimes it's really hard to pick out these middle-of-the-pack tight ends. But I'm going to give you 2 tight ends that you should feel comfortable starting here in week 4. So I'm going to start Logan Thomas from the Washington football team playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have the 2nd best defense overall, but they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Logan Thomas has averaged 7.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8 pass targets per game. Now, he's only scored 5 fantasy points the last 2 weeks. He put up 12 fantasy points in week 1, but he's getting the volume that you want to see at that tight end position, averaging 8 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 83% of the snaps, touches the ball 14% of that time. He's projected at 7.4 fantasy points here in week 4. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 51.5 points scored in this game. So I'm going to start Logan Thomas here versus the Baltimore Ravens. Another tight end that I'm going to start is Dalton Schultz from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Dalton Schultz has averaged 8.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.7 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 69% of the snaps, touches the ball 12% of that time. He's projected at 7.2 fantasy points here in week 4. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 55.5 points scored in this game. They're favored by 5. Now, I know I'm giving you a lot of the Dallas Cowboys pass catchers for these starts, so of course, don't start 2 of these guys in the same lineup. But if you are looking for a tight end to start here in week 4, you're struggling at the tight end position, this guy's getting the volume. 6 and 10 pass targets in the last 2 weeks. He's been productive. He's got a great matchup here in week 4. So I'm going to start Dalton Schultz here versus the Cleveland Browns. Okay, a couple of sits for you at the tight end position. I'm going to sit Greg Olsen from the Seattle Seahawks playing the Miami Dolphins, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing tight ends. Greg Olsen has only averaged 6.3 fantasy points per game on the season, only getting an average of 3.7 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 67% of the snaps, touching the ball 8% of that time. He's only projected at 5.3 fantasy points here in week 4. He doesn't have a good matchup, although Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game with 54.5 points scored in this game. I'm going to sit Greg Olsen here versus the Miami Dolphins. And another tight end that I'm going to sit is Tyler Eifert from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a good defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Tyler Eifert has only averaged 4.8 fantasy points per game on the season. He's only getting an average of 3.3 pass targets per game, on the field for 59% of the snaps. Just not enough volume for Tyler Eifert for me to give the start here. He is projected at 7 fantasy points here in week 4, but he only scored 2 fantasy points off of 3 pass targets last week. Vegas thinks this is going to be a somewhat low-scoring game here. 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Jacksonville Jaguars trailing by 3. So I'm going to sit Tyler Eifert here versus the Cincinnati Bengals.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video, or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.